very interesting fact about Kennedy that you write about in your book, and it's the story of him attending the National Book Award,
Hmm. Right.
and how badly he wanted to be considered as a writer. And Profiles of Courage, his book,
Mhm.
was ghostwritten for the most part, correct?
Absolutely.
And still won a Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah.
Um, what does that tell you about his character that he, you know, accepted the Pulitzer Prize, and it mattered that much to him?
Right, and didn't just accept it, but as I was able to prove for the first time, really worked behind the scenes to get it for himself, and was kind of, sometimes seemed more interested in the politics of the Pulitzer than the politics of the country as a whole. This is a great example of what we were talking about earlier, where writing can be very personal, and sitting down to write, or in this case, sitting down to not write, can really show a human side of people. Kennedy's book is a pretty good, nonfiction history book. It's a huge bestseller. When I talk to people at book events, in the pre-pandemic times, a lot of them had read it and remembered it fondly from their childhood. It does a good job. It's not, historians can and should quibble with it, but it's a fine work of trade history. And there's nothing wrong with the fact that it was mostly done by Ted Sorensen, his aide, and with a lot of help, not just from Sorensen, but a lot of history professors behind the scenes who chipped in and did research and edited passages and all kinds of other stuff. Um, there's nothing wrong with that. The reason it became such a huge bestseller was because it had a very popular, very charismatic senator attached to it. That's how these things work, like we were just talking about. Sometimes the name attached to the book matters as much as the book itself. So it was a solid book, and it was a huge success because Kennedy was an interesting figure. All of that is fine. All of that is a story that has been echoed in many different points in American political history and American publishing history. The difference was that Kennedy really, really craved literary fame. And it starts even earlier than that. It starts, one of the stories that I tell in my book is before even they came up with the idea, and I say they, but really I have documents that show that Ted Sorensen was the one who came up with the idea for Profiles in Courage. But when they were sort of thinking, what's a book we can come up with that can help Senator Kennedy take the next step in his political evolution, Kennedy met with a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, and he would talk to her, and he told her, I think I'd rather win the Pulitzer than be president. There was just this real desire to have literary fame, even if when it actually came time to do the literary work, Kennedy would talk a great talk, but then rarely follow through and rely on the work of others. And so everything about the book was a big success. Let's set the Pulitzer Prize aside. In the year that the book came out, before the Pulitzer Prize was even announced, it had become a huge bestseller. It had become a huge political asset for him. It was something that, when he would get introduced on Meet the Press, he would be introduced as an author. He got to do lots of book events. What politician wouldn't like their name linked to the word courage again and again by mainstream journalists? And that's what was happening for Kennedy. So this was a book that had sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and Kennedy was very heavily involved in the marketing of his book. One of my favorite details I found in the archive was that Kennedy writing a letter to the editor saying, I think we should make the author photo a little bit bigger. But that helps the book sell, and that's an understandable desire, and probably a smart political one. So the book was a huge success in political terms, in sales terms. Kennedy should have been content, especially since he didn't do that much work on the book. And frankly, he couldn't have done that much work on the book because of the back surgeries he was having in that
I'm
time
sorry to
period.
interrupt. Was there a large advance for the book? Did he get a lot of maybe?
No, it was the book shocked. It was published by Harper and Brothers, and they were shocked that it sold as well as it did too. Kennedy and Sorensen had worked on a magazine article about political courage, and when Sorensen sent Kennedy the first draft that Sorensen had written, he said, I think there might be a book in here, and I know an editor at Harper. Why don't you want me to run it by him? Do you want to run it by him? And so from there, Harper was interested, and they were, of course, very happy to be working with an up and coming politician, but nobody expected it to sell the way it did. So it was kind of shocking to everybody, and it was, it exceeded everyone's expectations. Kennedy didn't get a great advance for it, but it was, if I remember right, he used a lot of his advance to pay for some of the advertising and to help promote it at the beginning, because the goal for him was to have the book get his name out there, and get his name out there in this context of American history and great leaders and all that other stuff.
Which is pretty genius in
Yeah,
some.
it was. I mean, it would be smart for any politician, but especially for him, somebody who was really good looking and on, glossy magazines, to also say, well, I have an intellectual side, I have a bookish side. And there's no question that he genuinely did care about books and liked to talk to historians. That's very smart. He could offer you the 1-2 punch, the best of all worlds. And, Obama was somebody who was really charismatic too, but also had a very cerebral side. And you could get, you could appeal to more people in more ways. So Kennedy had all this working for him, and he had, every reason to be not just content and happy, but to be ecstatic that the book was doing this well. But he wanted more than that. He wanted literary fame. And so part of literary fame was going to the National Book Awards. And this is actually the story I tell at the beginning of my book, where Kennedy gave the keynote address at the National Book Awards, and Eudora Welty was there, Flannery O'Connor was there, Auden was there, and there are great pictures of Kennedy smiling and talking with them both, and getting to sort of be next to literary fame. But Kennedy wanted literary fame for himself, even though he wasn't able or didn't want to do literary work. And that's where you start to see behind the scenes, he put way more time into trying to get the book to sell well and to trying to get prizes for the book than he actually did into writing the book itself. I mean, I studied the schedules of Kennedy and Sorensen. I listened to old recordings. There's maybe 2 hours worth of dictated recordings that survived. I looked at all the drafts, compared dates on the drafts, compared handwriting, which is tricky to do because Sorensen and Kennedy's handwriting actually looks pretty similar. But I really spent a lot of time trying to see, maybe Kennedy had more to do with this than I thought. And I actually found an example in one of Kennedy's notebooks where his handwriting ended up being a few consecutive pages in the final book. So he did a little bit of work, but mostly he didn't, because he didn't have the time and he was dealing with surgeries. Where he got really involved was in the marketing push, and especially for the Pulitzer Prize. Remember, years earlier, he had talked to a Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer and told her, I'd rather win the Pulitzer Prize than be president. And I guess he really meant it, because I found documents at the Kennedy Presidential Library where he was working behind the scenes with his father, Joseph Kennedy, to get the Pulitzer Prize for his book. And so they knew someone named Arthur Kroc, who was a very prominent journalist at the time, who was closely affiliated with the Pulitzers, and they sort of used Kroc to influence and talk to other people involved on the board. Kroc helped the book kind of move categories where it had a better chance. And in the end, the book did win the Pulitzer Prize, even though Kennedy didn't write the book. And what's so interesting is, if he had never gone for the Pulitzer Prize, I think this would be seen as one of the happier aspects of Kennedy's legacy. Because like I said, it was a good book. It was a huge hit. It was a political benefit for him. All the intrigue about ghostwriting and who actually wrote the book and is there a scandal here happened after the Pulitzer. There wasn't any, journalists loved Kennedy. There wasn't any journalists, they might gossip about it among themselves. And in fact, they did, man, I wonder how much the ghostwriter got of this best-selling book, because it's selling better than anyone thought. But nobody was trying to document in the media who really wrote this book until the Pulitzer Prize. So in a sense, Kennedy's desire for literary fame kind of came back to bite him, because once he took the step from best-selling book to best-selling Pulitzer Prize-winning book, that's when the journalists started digging around. That's when the whiff of scandal started to come out. And that's when he, in a very Kennedy fashion, had to kind of ruthlessly squash these rumors and get people around him to cover for him, so this scandal didn't end up hurting his political reputation.
But in reality, does Kennedy actually have writing chops, or is he just...
He was a really good editor. That National Book Awards speech is, I think, a good example. That Ted Sorensen put it through a lot of drafts, but Kennedy he was good at cutting. He was good at swapping out a word choice. He was good at making things sound better and sound simpler. So he definitely had a good literary ear, and he was a great editor, and he was good at delivering the speeches as well. And also, he just cared about literary audiences and books, and that mattered, because his speechwriters could be doing lots of different things, but he wanted them to focus on this audience and to focus on burnishing this appeal. So you definitely have to give him credit in those realms. But in terms of sitting down and just pumping out page after page, there's just not very much evidence of that. One of the craziest examples of this, I think, is that when it came time to write the preface and the acknowledgments, Kennedy actually did write that. And then he had Sorensen edit it. And Sorensen had really good edits for him, because Kennedy had forgot to thank his wife. And Kennedy had also forgot to even mention Ted Sorensen. And so, Sorensen, in a note to Kennedy that I looked at the library, just wrote TCS, his initials, TCS ? So Kennedy ended up adding a sentence that was sort of like, I just want to thank Ted Sorensen for assembling the materials that this book was based on. Just the absolute bare minimum that you could give for a guy who actually wrote the book. But, that kind of stuff happens in political writing. Once this became a scandal, though, and remember, this entire scandal has been driven by Kennedy's literary ego, Sorensen didn't just swear under an affidavit that he didn't write the book. He and Kennedy pointed to that sentence as proof. They're like, look, yeah, Ted had a little work to do on the book, but we were honest about it. We mentioned it. It's not like we were trying to hide anything. When in reality, the only reason that sentence was there in the first place was because Sorensen had to remind Kennedy, shouldn't you at least mention me when I actually wrote the book? And that, those kinds of details are small. This is not the Cuban Missile Crisis. I fully admit that. But this is a very human moment, and a moment where Kennedy could have chosen to do it a couple different ways. And so I think the way he did choose to approach his literary fame tells us something about him as a human being.
Yeah, that's such a strange story. But can the Pulitzer Prize, is it a committee? I don't know, but can the Pulitzer Committee take back the award, or they're never going to do it?
Yeah, at this point, there's an award for profiles in courage that Pete Buttigieg won as a kid. It's too institutionalized at this point, but there, it starts out with subject experts who review the different fields like biography and history. And so they did not recommend Kennedy's book. It was only after the board, which is made up of more kind of public figures like the publisher of the Boston Herald and people affiliated with Columbia University, when those kinds of people got involved for the final round, then they were the ones who sort of, with the Kennedys offering their encouragement behind the scenes, they were the ones that elevated profiles in courage to that point, because it wasn't even a book based on original research. It was a book based on good work by other people. And it was a book where a lot of historians would read drafts and offer feedback and more suggestions behind the scenes. So it wasn't the kind of book that would typically even be considered for the Pulitzer. It was just that Kennedy really, really wanted a Pulitzer.
Yeah. And in some ways, one of the main reasons for your book is it's almost like myth busting, right? And in some ways, Kennedy his legacy is intact. Most people think, before your book, obviously, if they've read your book, they think differently, but most people think he wrote the book, he knows how to write, he's a good writer, he won a Pulitzer Prize, for God's sake. So like, the guy was the best of both worlds in some way. And the kind of the enigma of Kennedy is still kicking to this day.